In this video, we're going to take our planning process that we went through here, and we're going to start scaffolding this out into our React application. So we're going to pick small features one at a time to build them, test them, get them running, and we're going to kind of mock out each of these components that we've identified. So I have starter files here that are a modified version of where we left off last time. The thing that I have added here is that there are a couple of classes for the EndScreen and the stats and the trivia item that you can either download individually and add to your project that you're following along with, or you can just grab the starter project itself. If you're grabbing the starter project, make sure that you run npm install before you start working in here. I have my npm run start command running, so I've got this pulled up on my local host so I can start working on this quiz page. So what I want to do is just get these individual 4 components created, and we will add a little comment to each of them that describes their responsibility. So we're going to need a game.js, and we're going to need a stats.js and a trivia item.js and an EndScreen.js. All of these are just blank. I have an extension installed here, which is called here we go, ES7 React Redux, etc. snippets. If you want to install that, that gives you the ability to, in your project, if you have like a JS folder, you can use some text expansions. Like this gives me a React class that is named the same thing as my file. So if I do React functional component with export RFCE, that just gives me a function here that has the same name as my file, and my cursor is set to both of those locations, so I can just type game to rename my component to game here. The only modification that I'll make is that I don't need to actually do that importing for the version of React that we're on. So you can either use that snippets thing, or you can just create one of your components, paste it into the other files, and then use F2 to rename the component in each of these. And then I'm going to bring in our single responsibility description into my components, and I'm going to use what's called JS docs for the format, which helps the IntelliSense. So when you start using the component, you'll see whatever description you put here show up in your IntelliSense in Visual Studio Code. JS doc just is a formatted comment that starts with /**. So it's like a multi-line comment, except with 2 asterisks here. So we can say the EndScreen renders the final game stats. And trivia item renders an individual trivia question and waits for a user's answer. And our stats here. The stats component renders the score and current question number. And the game All right, so we've got our placeholder components and we have our description for each of them of their responsibilities. Whoops, got a little typo here. Let's put a placeholder in each of these so that they say something. We could just have them say their name. And then we can go to our quiz page. So this is that page that's loaded in our router here when we go to /quiz. So this is where we want to work. Our quiz page, instead of putting this on the page, we can put our game on the page. And I am letting letting Visual Studio auto import that for me. Just make sure that you actually get that imported. And we should see game show up on the page, which means that we can go into our game component and our game, like we had mapped out on the board here. So we got our quiz page. Our game should have the stats, the trivia item, and the end screen in there. So let's just get all three of those. Stats up at the top, letting Visual Studio auto import that. Let's get a trivia item on there, and let's get the end screen on there, and using tab and enter to let Visual Studio import all of those. So we can see our placeholder, so we know that we've got all of those components loaded when we're on that quiz page. So small feature built, tested, we can move on to the next thing. So I think where we'll start is working on this game component and adding in some of the state, like the score, the current question number, whether or not the game is over, and eventually that trivia data. One thing I want to introduce here is that we can actually create instead of a div, a React fragment. So if I just get rid of the div in the current version of React, we can use a fragment to indicate that these things need to be grouped, but we don't actually want to insert any HTML to do that grouping. We don't need an unnecessary div here. And the reason why we do that is because we can't just return a series of React components next to one another. They have to have a single parent element. So React fragment allows us to create that parent element. So let's start with the game. And I want to create some state here. And I'm letting React auto import this. So we've got use state imported. So remember, state gives you two things. It gives you the value and a setter function to update that value in a way that allows the React lifecycle to trigger so that things get re-rendered. What I want to do, instead of just creating a couple separate pieces of state for score, trivia index, is the game over, I want to create one state object. So I'm going to create an object here. What we're passing in is the initial state. I'm going to say that the score is a property with a value of 0. The trivia index is a property with a value of 0. And is game over is a property with a value of false. And then instead of calling this value, we could call this game state. And instead of set value, we can say set game state. So we could store all three of these as separate state variables, like called score, trivia index, is game over. But there will be times when we want to update all of this data together. This is kind of related data. Like when we want to reset the game, we're going to reset all three pieces of state. It can be more efficient for us to set these up as a shared object or properties of a shared object, so that when we make a change, like resetting all three of these fields, that's one React render. Also makes it easier for us later if we want to take this game state and move it elsewhere, like bump it up the architecture. If we want to put it on the quiz page, it's easier to do that when all of those pieces of state are bundled together. And then we can just pass the props down to game. Okay, so there's our game state. So what we can do is pull out those individual values of score, trivia index, is game over from our game state so that we have them in variables, and let's put them on the page. So I'm just going to create a paragraph and put the score in here to see that the score is working. Do one for the trivia index. Do one for our Boolean is game over, and let's say game is over, game is not over. And this is a ternary conditional operator. So here's our condition, a true false value. If it's true, it'll say game is over. If it's false, it'll say game is not over. So let's check that out. We've got 0, 0, game is not over. And we've seen that if we go ahead and open up our developer tools, more tools, developer tools, or just hit the hotkey on your keyboard, and you have your components panel. So if you have the React Dev Tools installed, you can use this to see your React hierarchy of components here. And if I look through them, I can find, here's my game component. You know, it's nested within the quiz page, inside of a route, the switch, the router, the app. We can see all the components that are rendering. And when we're on the game, we can see a bunch of state here, and we can manipulate it. So we can say like, oh, if the score goes to 10, we want to see that re-render. It works. If we go from 0 to 2, that shows up here. If our game is now over and becomes true, it says game is over. So we've got our state, it's reactive, we can see the changes happening on our page. Now let's get our actual trivia data into our application. So I believe I included this. Yes, I've included this in the starter file, so you can grab it from the starter files or use your trivia data that you created in the previous versions. This is just pulled from that trivia API and put into a local file. And I've got a little note here that eventually this data doesn't come from our local project source code, but is served up to us from a server. So eventually we'll store these quiz questions in a database and be able to pull them on demand. But just to simplify this startup, we are starting to build this application. To simplify that, we will use this local file. So this is just an array exported here as the default. Each of these has category type, difficulty question, correct answer, incorrect answers. So in this file, we can import the trivia data. Which, if we go ahead and print this out to the console, we should see, when we are on that quiz page, an array with 10 items in it. Good. We can use the trivia index to pull out an individual question. And then our trivia question, you can even see the IntelliSense here is picking up the structure of this variable. We know it has category type, question, correct answer, incorrect answers. That all of that's being parsed from this JavaScript file here. So we can say correct answer, incorrect answers, question equals trivia question. Whoops, let's try printing those out. So we can see the correct answer at 5, the incorrect answers, the question. Let's try putting this on the page here. So we'll add another paragraph. Let's just put the question onto the page. How many dice are used in the game of Yahtzee? And if we go to our components view and we manipulate the current index here to be 3, we know we have 10 questions, so 3 is within our range. We're not going to cause any errors, and we can see that the question changes on the page. So it looks like we have that trivia data hooked up. So that's enough of our game mocked. If we go back to our plan here, we have our state data for our game, and currently that trivia data is coming from a module that we have locally. Eventually that would become either state or props for our game component that gets passed in. Let's do our stats, which render our game stats to the page. So the score and the question number. So if we go to our stats component, we want to declare that it needs some information as props that get passed in. So we can just create a variable here and then say like props.score to refer to one of those properties that's passed in, or we can destructure the variables from the props here. So we can say the score we'll need, and we'll need the trivia index and the total questions. And actually, as I'm thinking about it, I don't even care that this is what I want to know instead of index is question number. So the stats needs to know the score, the question number, and the total questions. And the structure of our stats markup, which we created in the quiz game, it was an unordered list with a class name of stats. And then into that, we had a list item for each stat. And that list item had two divs in it. One for the label, like score, and one here for the value with our score variable. And let's just work on one of them. So I have a stats.css, which has the formatting of our stats from the game. So our component up here, the stats component for the list, sets things up to display using Flexbox and gets them side by side. Our container is our list item that sets up some styling for, you know, the background color, the padding of the container, and then some styling for our label and the value. So I just want to go through and apply each of these. So copy the stats container class name and put that here. And let's grab the label. And this is named the same thing, but value. And let's import the stats.css. So we should be able to use this now. If we pass in a score, we should see that score show up on the page. And if we check it out right now, we should see score, but it's not quite working because we don't actually have any value in that score. We don't pass in a score, so this is undefined. So React doesn't render anything inside of this div. So remember that components are functions. So this is the definition of the function. You want to go into your game component where you're using that function, and then you can pass in score equals like 0, or score equals whatever our score variable is. So if I do that, it should now say score 0. And if we change our state here to be a score of 10, that reactively re-renders. So let's get rid of some of these paragraphs. And we've got our stats up at the top now. Let's flip back to our stats component. And remember how when we were doing our diagramming here, we said like we're doing broad strokes. There's our stats component. But if we break that down even further, there's some stuff that we can refactor into another stat singular component. So instead of what we did in our HTML, where we just like copied and pasted this and changed the question number, total questions here. Let's refactor this into a stat component. Whoops. So I'm going to return this markup here. And the stat component should have a label and a value passed into it. And if you pass those two in, we will just use the label here and then put the value here. So if I use stat and say that the label is equal to score and the value is equal to our score variable, these two things should be functionally equivalent in terms of what we see on the page. Score, score. The advantage is now we can delete this, and when we want to display the total, where we are in the game, the question number out of the total questions, we can just do something like this. Question number, and then pass in a string where we say, here's our question number out of the total questions. This will be undefined. Yeah, doesn't look great here. What we actually need to do is pass these in. So same deal. Let's go back to our game here and make sure that we pass in for question number trivia index +1 and the number of questions. Actually, let's clean this up. Let's create a local variable up here. So question number is trivia index +1, because remember, we're talking about arrays and indices. We start counting at 0, but in sort of the user's mind, it's not question 0, it's question 1. That's how we normally count. So that's why it's trivia index +1. And then we can say the num questions is equal to our trivia data, our array dot length. And what did we call this property here? Total questions. Question number 1 of 10. And I guess saying question number is a little redundant here, so we can flip back. And if we go back to our stats, just say question 1 of 10. And if we change our game, this should update. So if we go to index 3, that should be the 4th question out of 10. So we got our stats built. I do want to emphasize one really important thing here is that props are one of the main ways that we can communicate across components. So remember in our diagram, we said the game is responsible for knowing the score and the current place in the array. And the way that we notified the stats component about that is by just passing that information in as a prop. And when the data changes in our game, that updates the props that are given to our stats, and our stats re-renders. So actually, this is important enough that let's put this down as a communication strategy. When we are going from parent to child, you know, we're going from our game, which is the parent, to the child stats, pass data as props. And we'll come back and update this. This isn't the only way to pass information from parent to child. And we'll update this when we sort of go in the reverse direction of letting the trivia item modify something about the game. We'll need a different strategy. I also want to show, before we finish up the stats component, what it would look like to document this. So I'm going to grab from off screen the JS doc that I would use to document a component like this. So JS doc, if you Google it, there are a couple of keywords that it adds to your documentation syntax to allow you to define what a function, our functional components accept. So we're saying that it takes a parameter, props, which is an object, and then we can document all of the fields in that object. So we can say that it takes a score, question num, I guess I used different variable names in my solution here. That's fine. So I'll just update these to match. So we're saying question number, total questions. These are all three of these numbers, and you'd put whatever type you want in here. So if we said we needed a string, we'd put that in here, or a Boolean, we'd put that in here. In this case, all three of these are numbers. So when we do this JS doc, if I go back to my game and I start trying to use my stats component, let's click on it and then hover over the stats component, I can see our description down here. The stats component renders the score. And we can also see that annotation here, that it says that the stats component is expecting, we see the signature of the function here, and then our documentation in line here, it's telling us the score is a number, question number is a number, total questions is a number. So doing that documentation is really helpful when you are working on a large project and you need to remember some component, how it works, what it does. Maybe it's a component that you wrote a week ago or a month ago and you've kind of forgotten the details. That documentation can help. It's also really important when you're working on a team to keep your code documented. When we get into TypeScript, you will be able to omit some of that. So like our stats, instead of having this type information here, it would be actually in the code as a type annotation. And I think, one more thing before we leave the stats. You can see that generally up until this point, we've been putting one component per file, and that is a really good strategy. Here, I violated that rule because we have a component here, stat, that is really just intimately linked to the stats component. We wouldn't use it elsewhere. We wouldn't need to import this elsewhere in our current game structure. So if I have a component that is really kind of just like internal details of how another component works, like our stat versus stats, I will sometimes include those in the same file. You can totally split these out into separate files if you want, and then kind of split the CSS along with it. In this case, I just found it easier to keep these two together. Let's move on to our end screen. So our end screen is going to have the final information for our game. So we'll put the stats will still be on there, but the end screen will have a little trophy, the score, the top score, and a replay button. So we're going to have a div wrapping this, and then we'll have an H1 that says like quiz completed. And then we can put a little, I'm just going to use a trophy emoji here, if I can get my emoji keyboard to work. Where is it? There we go. And this is just for mock purposes. We could get an icon or an image file later to kind of clean this up and make it more cross-platform. We're going to want a retry button. And then we're also going to want the score and the top score. There we go. So we still have this rendered from our game. So we can see this as we're working. This is another one of those situations where I am going to want to display score and the top score in a similar way. So I'm going to break this out into a component, kind of like how we did our stats here, but these components are going to have completely different styling. So let's create an end stat that takes in a label and a value, and it returns a div with the label value. So now instead of saying score here, we can say endstat with a label of score and a value. We're going to need to get the score passed into us. We'll fix that in a second. And let's do top score, or we could call this best score. So this end screen now needs, that score and that top score passed in. So let's say score and best score are things that are props passed into our end screen. Let's make sure that we provide those here. The score is equal to whatever the score is, and until we implement this top score feature, let's just make sure that the best score is always set to something like 0. So that should get something showing up here. We can see score is 0, best score is 0, and if we open up the dev tools, we should be able to play with the game state and change the score to be 100 and see that update here. Let's get the styling in place here. So I have a set of classes here that are similar to kind of the structure of our stat screen, but they're different sets of styles. So we're going to have this to align all of our text, and this goes on the parent here, which should move everything. Whoops, got to make sure that we import the CSS. That should now align everything. Our trophy, this is just styling for that trophy emoji. Throw that class name here. Then we have styling for each stat container. So that goes here. This just adds some spacing between the stats. So now there's a little bit of spacing between stats. And then we're going to have something to style the label. Style the label and do a similar thing for the value here. Value. And then the last one is just some styling for our button. So class name, class name equals EndScreen _ button. And all of these are in that BEM name styling, naming convention. So there we go. We got our end screen done, and it accepts information from our game. So this should eventually work fine when we get our score working and we get our high score feature built. The trickier thing that I want to show you with the end screen is this retry button. So we're in one of these situations where we need not a parent to communicate with a child, but a child to communicate back with the parent. So when we click this retry button, we need the game to reset. So all of these need to go back to score of 0, trivia index 0, game is not over. When that button is clicked, we don't have access to these things inside of our end screen component. So one way that we can do this is actually by passing in a function as a parameter. So we can say that EndScreen is going to accept an on retry click function. This is a parameter, and our button, when it is clicked, will call that function. So we're not saying what that function does. We are just exposing to whoever uses the end screen the ability to hook some logic into this button. Whatever the parent component decides it needs to do on retry click, the end screen doesn't care about those implementation details. So that means in game, up here, we could create a, let's do this. We'll get rid of our console log. We'll do this here. On restart game, this will be a function that sets the game state to a score of 0, trivia index of 0, and is game over of false. So here's our implementation detail of how we actually get the game restarting. And then we can pass this in. So we said that we have an on retry click property. We pass in our on restart game. So we can now test this, again, using our dev tools here. If I go into our game, and let's go ahead and say the score is 10, and the trivia index is 3, and the game is over. If I click on retry, we should see all of those change, and we should also see some of this update on the screen up here. So changed to our defaults. Is game over? Looks like it hasn't changed here. Let me double check. So that's probably just a quirk of the dev tools here, that this didn't actually get reset, because we are clearly resetting it here. So let's update our whiteboard to actually have that communication strategy listed. So if we need our child to communicate with the parent, we can pass functions as props. So our end screen can accept a function that mutates the game state. But our end screen doesn't have to know anything about the game state to be able to run that function. And same thing will happen in our trivia item. All right, let's flip back to the code. And we're doing well for the scaffolding here. I think what I want to do is actually get this end screen to trigger only when our game is over. So if our game is not over, then we'll just see trivia item on the page. And when it is over, we will see this quiz item, this quiz content show, or the quiz complete show up on the page. There are a number of ways that we could do that here. We could just use a ternary operator in our JSX. So is game over, question mark, and then we could put the trivia item or the end screen. And actually, I think I have these reversed. If the game is over, display the end screen. Otherwise, do the trivia item. And this will work. But this is harder to read and maybe a little bit less maintainable, because we're going to eventually need more to happen here for the trivia item. Like, we're going to have to get some of these props and pass them in for the trivia item only if the game isn't over. So another way that we can do this same structure is to just create a variable that's empty. If is game is over, if is game is over, then we can say that our page content is equal to this JSX. Otherwise, our page content is equal to our trivia item. And then in our markup, no need for a ternary operator here. We can just say page content. So if I refresh the page, our default state is that the game is not over. So we see trivia item. And then when I click on this, our end screen pops up and I should be able to flip back and forth here. I should also be able to hit retry to get us to that initial state. So what we're doing here is you can just store JSX directly into a variable and put that onto the page, same as you would put any other variable onto the page. So that feature is done, and our end screen, let's follow good programming habits. So I'm going to pause the screen recording for a second while I fill in the JS docs. So I have just documented it the way we did it in the previous, in the stats here, where you say that your end screen takes a props object. It has then each field documented using its type. So here the score is a number, best score is a number. On retry click is, and I'm using an arrow function to annotate that this is a function that takes no parameters and returns void. We could also just put in function here as the type and not really describe anything about it. Or we could say that this is a function that technically gets a mouse event because this is a click, but I think this is fine for our types here. And if we want to describe any of these, we can add a little description. This is part of the JS docs syntax. So here we can say a function to run when the retry button is clicked. And again, if we go back to our game where we use that end screen, we can hover over it and see our IntelliSense completion, or our IntelliSense picking up the score, best score, retry click, the types. And then if I hit Control Space inside of my component here, let's actually delete these here and do that again, or Control Space, we should see up at the top of this list, auto completes for best score, on retry click, score, and then key is something built into all components. And if we hover over each attribute, we will see that documentation that we specified. So a function to run when the retry button is clicked. So again, documentation, really important on complex projects and on collaborative projects. So let's wrap up the scaffolding here. We've got our stats done, our end screen done, and then the component that has the most interaction is really our trivia item. So this is that component that we've identified here. Will be responsible for displaying the question, the answers, this next button, and then exposing a way to communicate with the game to actually get us to go to the next when you click on it, and to update the score when you click on the right answer. So for scaffolding this out, let's just start with getting the question and the correct answer and incorrect answers showing up on the page. So we are going to want to accept a correct answer prop, incorrect answers prop, and a question prop. Eventually we'll need some, like with our end screen, click handlers for when an answer is selected and when the next button is clicked, but this will be good to get us started. And then we just need to put those onto the page like we did in our quiz game. So we had a div that was the parent element, and that div had a class name that we have in the starter CSS. Oh, you know what? Actually, we do have a trivia item kind of block declared here, but we had no styling that went on that parent div. So we don't need that, even though we had that in previous versions. We had a paragraph with the question, and that had a class name that we were just seeing there. Trivia item underscore question. And while we're at it, let's make sure that we pass in to that trivia item the right props from our game so that we can see something showing up on the page. So I'm going to grab these two variables and bring them down here. So only when the game is not over are we going to try grabbing information from our array. So our question here, and then the destructured information here. And let's pass in our question. We're taking this local variable and passing it in under the prop of question. So that shows up on the page, but it doesn't have the right styling. So that is leading me to believe that if I go back to my trivia item, I forgot to import our trivia item.css. There we go. Now that's showing up in the right styling. While we're at it, let's make sure that we pass in correct answer and incorrect answers from our game. So this has a correct answer and incorrect answers prop. And we're going to pass in our variables that we have pulled from our JavaScript trivia API, which was stored locally as an array. So here we can see that we're actually going from, if we look at our trivia data, the API had this convention of using underscores to separate words, and we need to convert to our convention here. So we have variables with underscores in our game when we do the destructuring. And then when we go to our props, we have said, all of our properties are camel case. So let's make sure that our camel case correct answer is being given the variable here that has underscores. So we're pulling some local data and we're making sure that everything matches our naming convention for props here. So with those passed in, we should be able to go to our trivia game and start mapping out those answers. So we have an unordered list that has a list item in it that has a button in it. That was our structure from our HTML. And so our trivia item, our answers, this styled the unordered list and made it a grid so that we could get 2 by 2 for our answers. And then we had our button specific styling. Let's put the correct answer here. And let's see, were there any other classes? No, that should be it. So we should see our list items show up in a grid, but there's nothing else in the grid. So let's go ahead and duplicate this. And in the next video, we'll talk about how to deal with arrays. For now, let's just hard code this. So that the correct answer always shows up, and then each of our incorrect answers. Good. And then below this unordered list, we're going to add the new thing that we're creating, which is a button that says next, and I'm going to use this Unicode character. We could grab an icon later to make it, again, more cross-platform because this depends on the font that's loaded. And let's also make sure that we get our styling applied. So this is a new thing that wasn't in the previous version, a class of trivia item __ next button. And our next button is going to have that specific styling, plus we're going to give it this button styling. So we want to grab this class, separate these by a space so that both classes are being applied to our next button. There we go. And you know what? While we're at it, let's wrap this up by actually getting this next button working. And this is going to be really similar to that communication strategy we used in EndScreen, where the next button, it does not need to know any of the implementation details. It just needs to be passed a function. So go back to trivia item and say on next click, on click equals on next click. So whatever function is passed in, that will be run when this button is clicked. And if we go to our game, we can create a function for on next. Let's call it something slightly different. On load next question. And this we can use to set our game state to go to the next index. So we want to go from the current trivia item, trivia index, to the next one. So we're setting our game state to have a property of trivia index that's set to our current index, this variable, which we've destructured from our game state, plus 1. Now, this is going to cause a problem as currently written. So let's go ahead and connect this up to our trivia on next click equals on load next question. If I go to my game and I set my score to 10, and then I click on this next, if we look at what happened, our score disappeared, and look at our state, we did go to the next trivia item, but the rest of our properties disappeared. So when we are setting our state and we have multiple properties, we need to make sure that we don't forget to set those other properties too. And one of the easiest things that we can do here is spread our game state variable. So that is our variable here that has the current values of score. Trivia index is game over. So what we're doing with spread is just grabbing each of those properties and its values, copying them over here, and then overriding the trivia index. So if we check this out now and refresh it and click next, our score shouldn't disappear. And if I change my score to 10 and click next, it stays at 10. So that's important enough for us to add a note here. We are using the spread operator to copy the game state and override the trivia index. We will do that anytime we are changing one of these properties of our game state. And you know what? I kind of want to rename these now that I'm looking at them. I want to call this, so I'm going to hit F2 to rename this, restart game. And let's call this load next question. And you can see that using F2, it renamed it here and renamed it here. And the reason why I'm using different variable names, like this is load next question, this was on next click, was to help folks differentiate between the property name and the property value. And if I name them all the same thing, folks get confused about which is which. So this isn't perfect. We'll have to fix this in the next video too, because if we keep clicking next, eventually we'll get an error when we get through all of the questions and we try to go to the next question that is outside of the array. So what we'll need to do is actually manage our is game over state. So if we exceed what we have in our array, then the game's over. We can go to the end screen. Let's wrap this up with I'm going to pause the video here and add documentation for our props that we created. Okay, so I just added a property of correct answer, which is a string, incorrect answers, which is an array of strings, question string, on next click, which is a function that takes no parameters, returns nothing. So that won't change anything about how our application works, but it does improve our IntelliSense. If we ever come back here and need to hover over any of these to see what they should be, we can now see our annotations in there, like string array. So we have a lot of our scaffold at this point. For our game, we are able to actually flip using our dev tools between the quiz game and the game over screen. And we have all of the state set up properly to be passed in here when the quiz is over, and the ability to restart from that end screen. What we'll do in the next video is really dive into the interactivity of this trivia item component. We'll make sure that these answers are shuffled, that we get the feedback, that when you click one of these answers, and that we track the score, increment the score when you get the answer right.